Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in. Today we're unpacking the absolute bedrock rules of clinical psychology. Think of this as a masterclass, where we're going to teach you exactly how moral judgments actively shape effective therapy. It's not just about, learning the science of the mind, it's really about understanding that profound responsibility of doing the right thing for another human being when they're at their absolute most vulnerable.
To kick things off, I want you to ask yourself a pretty wild question. What actually happens when a therapist's ethical code directly conflicts with the law? It's a provocative thought, right? But it perfectly primes us for the incredibly high stakes of this discipline. In the real clinical world, strict moral frameworks collide with complex, messy situations all the time. The answers? Well, they aren't always black and white.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the foundation of clinical ethics, then dive into consent and confidentiality limits. After that, competence and professional boundaries, followed by culture, assessment, and treatment. And finally, we'll wrap up with technology, law, and supervision.
Okay, part 1. The foundation of clinical ethics, the moral pillars of psychology.
Now, professional codes, they aren't totally universal. Take a look at the APA Ethics Code alongside the Canadian Code of Ethics, and you're going to spot some subtle but really critical differences. The Canadian Code has this unique feature called differential weighting. Basically, what this means is that if ethical principles ever clash, respect for human dignity acts as the ultimate trump card. It's given the greatest weight above literally all other rules. It's such a fascinating and frankly deeply human way to structure our moral priorities.
Moving right along to Section 2, Consent and Confidentiality Limits, setting the stage for therapy.
So imagine setting up your practice, right? A client sits across from you for the very first time. Before you even think about asking about their struggles, you absolutely must secure informed consent. And to do that, you have to hit 3 mandatory components. First up is knowledge. You need to teach the client about the goals and the risks. Second is freedom, meaning zero coercion, it's got to be completely voluntary. And third is capacity. Do they have the cognitive ability to actually choose? And hey, if you're working with a child who legally lacks capacity, you still have an ethical duty to gain what's called their assent, so an active agreement in words they actually understand. Long story short, informed consent is the cornerstone you have to lay before any real therapeutic work begins.
As part of that initial setup, we have to talk about secrets. You must tell your client up front about the absolute limits of confidentiality. The seal gets legally and ethically broken in a few very specific scenarios. A risk of self-harm or suicide, a specific threat of harm to others, which is the duty to protect, suspected child or elder abuse for mandatory reporting, or if records get subpoenaed by a court. Building real trust means teaching your clients these boundaries from day one, so nobody is ever caught off guard.
All right, Section 3, Competence and Professional Boundaries, the ongoing work in the room.
Okay, get this. Did you know that in psychology, professional knowledge has a half-life of just 10 to 12 years? That is wild. It means within a decade, half of what a clinician learned back in grad school might be completely obsolete. Because of that, lifelong learning is an absolute ethical mandate. It's not just a suggestion. If you decide to expand your practice into a brand new area, you can't just guess your way through it. You must seek out relevant training and supervision. Honestly, you even have a strict ethical duty to stop practicing entirely if your own emotional health becomes impaired.
You also have to fiercely protect the space between you and the client. It's about actively managing the inherent power imbalance in the room. This is exactly why multiple relationships are strictly prohibited. You absolutely cannot be someone's therapist and, say, their business partner or their weekend golf buddy. It severely compromises care. Using your expert status to exploit a client goes against the very fabric of clinical ethics.
Next up, Section 4, Culture, Assessment, and Treatment, ensuring fair and effective care.
So, having a multicultural orientation, that isn't just some optional, nice-to-have skill. It requires what we call cultural humility. This means you intentionally step back and let the client lead. They are the undeniable expert of their own lived experience and their own cultural journey. It takes deep self-awareness to recognize your own biases. Because if a therapist ignores racial and cultural factors, they run a massive risk of just reproducing systemic inequalities right there in the therapy room.
And this humility, it extends directly to the actual tools a clinician uses. Whether it's maintaining strict test security, which means keeping testing manuals completely hidden from the public eye, or actively monitoring if your evidence-based interventions are, actually working, Every single clinical decision has to be rooted in rigorous, unbiased science. You've got to dodge confirmationary bias, you have to ensure that your testing instruments have established validity for the specific population you're assessing, and the big takeaway here, if a treatment isn't helping the client, it's your ethical imperative to either adapt it or discontinue it.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 5, Technology, Law, and Supervision, Navigating Modern Complications.
Look, the digital age has completely rewritten the rulebook. Expanding into telepsychology introduces this whole new matrix of ethical risks. Suddenly, you're trying to figure out cross-border jurisdictional licensing, managing crises and emergencies from hundreds of miles away, securing private data against digital breaches, and somehow meeting strict psychometric testing standards over a webcam? The rules of the game are evolving so fast right now, and ignorance of these new technologies? Yeah, that is not an ethical defense.
And then, of course, we have the biggest technological shift of all, artificial intelligence. The unyielding rule here is that AI-assisted diagnosis and assessment must be used super cautiously. Algorithms have to remain totally subservient to distinctly human-driven case formulation. AI can definitely assist us, sure, but it can absolutely never replace the ethical duty to understand a client's unique human context. At the end of the day, the responsibility always rests squarely on human shoulders.
Which actually brings us full circle to that crazy question we asked at the very beginning of this explainer. What really happens when organizational demands or the law inevitably clashes with your ethics? Well, your ultimate goal is transparency, accountability, and resolving that conflict while fiercely protecting fundamental human rights. Best practices mean maintaining incredibly accurate documentation and, really importantly, empowering clients by giving them copies of their own reports. You are an advocate for the human being sitting across from you first and foremost.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on as you reflect on the therapist's journey. As therapy becomes increasingly digital and increasingly regulated, how do we ensure that essential human empathy remains at its core? How do we preserve the human element in an era of digital and algorithmic clinical practice? It's a massive puzzle to solve, but as we've learned today, building a rock-solid ethical foundation is absolutely the perfect place to start. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me today.